Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Chris. I'm joined with Roth. Now, Roth, you've seen Daredevil. You've seen a few episodes. We're going to talk about the beginning of the series and give your first impressions and talk a little bit about episode 1.
My first impressions are radtacular.
Radtacular. She's making up words here. So, let's talk about episode 1 first and just talk. I want to get a sense of, you know, there's so much when you're introducing characters again. There's so much about origin story. How much origin story do we get and how do they handle it here?
They handle it really well. You know, it's funny because we don't get too bogged down with it, but for those that are not familiar, it's certainly there.
Right.
This, in general, doesn't feel like anything really Marvel has ever done in a lot of ways, but it's certainly in terms of the origin, it's a slow build. They don't just kind of go in a minute. You know, I mean, and there's nothing against it, but The Flash, every episode is like, I am Barry Allen, this is my deal. It's not like that at all. It's like bringing you in, weaving you in. And maybe it's because they have the benefit that they know people will binge.
Oh, yeah.
And they'll get the arc.
I think, yeah, you definitely get that. It's almost like a 13-hour movie at some point.
Yeah, so they can be slower.
How did you feel about Charlie Cox as Daredevil, as Matt Murdock?
I am totally on board. Let me tell you something. This is seriously the most awesomely violent show I swear I've ever seen.
I asked you about casting, and you're like, I like the violence. The violence. Let's get to the violence. Charlie Cox does good violence in this.
He really does.
His violence is so good.
His fight scenes are amazing. But he's great at both.
Yes, he's great. But violence.
But the violence. His acting is very nice too. No, he's really good. It's interesting because they don't feel like two separate people. I don't know if that makes sense.
Right.
They really
there's a continuation.
There's a continuum. Whereas sometimes they really do feel like separate humans.
Right,
you know what I mean? But almost to the point that I wonder, eventually, as the city starts to understand that Daredevil exists, would his friends not put that together faster? It's not an issue yet, but
right. So, you know, we've got Daredevil just kind of coming into his own, like discovering, like, hey, I want to do this vigilante stuff. And the reason in the comics has always been, you know, I don't feel like I can do enough through the law, so I have to go out and be a vigilante. Is that preserved here?
You know, it's funny because he's already Daredevil. You know, like so when you talk about the origin, I'm talking about like him as a little kid. The flashback origins are weaved in throughout.
Right.
But it's right out of the gate. He's not called Daredevil. He doesn't have the red costume yet.
Right.
He has a really odd, it kind of looks like Dread Pirate Roberts. I mean, you guys have seen some of it.
Yeah. I mean, it's, Dread Pirate Roberts from Princess Bride, if you guys. Yeah.
But it's actually a really cool. You can see it there. It's actually a really cool costume in action.
Right.
It's very effective.
And Kingpin, we get a sense of him right off the bat. He's like in there from the beginning.
No, Kingpin isn't in the first episode, sadly. But it's okay because there's so much packed into this first episode. It's really establishing the tone of the world that you're in, the New York that you're in. And by that I mean you know, everybody says New York is a character, but New York is often a very different character, movie to movie, show to show. Sex and the City, New York is a very different New York than this New York.
Right.
They had a problem in the sense that Hell's Kitchen today is not the Hell's Kitchen that it was. When those
That's where we go to New York Comic Con.
Yeah.
It's in Hell's Kitchen.
Yeah, and it's totally nice and gentrified, but they've solved it very cleverly using an event that happened in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which you can probably figure out.
Yeah, so, but you were saying, we were talking about this before, you were saying this is Marvel Cinematic Universe, but it feels different because of some of the violence, because of some of the like darker tone. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, it feels really, really, it's interesting because, you know that they're connected so that they're gonna mention things that happen in the MCU, like Thor may get mentioned, that type of thing. But it's so distant, and which it feels right because they never would have met Thor, they wouldn't know, they would be like, supposedly there's this god with a hammer, I don't know, everything's crazy. But
which is kind of how it would be, right? I think everybody would just talk amongst themselves realistically, and you'd be like, people say he's a god, he's just an alien to me.
I feel like a lot of people really would be losing their minds too. But this world is so dark and so gritty, and I hate to keep it's like watching a UFC fight where you have to be like, there are those moments where you're like, oh my God, for the love of mercy, stop, mercy, more, I love it.
Do you feel like that's going to be the theme now for the Netflix shows, that it's going to be street level, everything kind of on that sort of more gritty, violent level?
I had a conversation with the head of Marvel Television about that today.
Hmm.
I think that yes and no. I think that Daredevil will have a slightly distinct, like, if you take Winter Soldier and Guardians, those
Right.
have very distinct tones, but they belong in the same universe. I think that's what
Right.
it'll be like this too. I think Daredevil will have a slightly different tone than Jessica Jones, but they will belong in the same world. What's interesting is that they are so much more morally ambiguous.
Right.
His choices are questionable. But the other thing too is that Kingpin, once you do meet him, is seriously maybe the most interesting character on the show.
And like I think that it sounds from what you're talking about that like every character has gray area in
Yes.
this. It's not
And
like
every character is interesting.
not everybody's like, oh hey, I'm just a do-gooder hero. It's like, I make some questionable choices sometimes.
Absolutely.
Which is more real life.
If anything, the one that comes out, and like he's even got his good side and his bad side, but or not so much bad, but questionable. But Foggy is the one that you're most kind of like, this is just kind of a nice guy.
Right.
He's the one so far.
In the comics, he was also just kind of a nice guy. So yeah.
Which I think fans will really like because
Yeah.
that's how he should be. But there are some changes that I think people will be interested in, some relationship dynamics that I think people will be surprised by.
Oh, cool.
It's really good. It's really good. I don't want to be overselling it to you.
Well, I mean, we're all going to get a chance to watch it really soon.
Yeah,
It's coming
I've
out
seen
on
5.
Oh,
so I still
awesome.
have more to discover.
It's coming out on April 10th. Right away that day, we'll have reviews for the first episodes, and we'll keep adding to it as we watch. So stay tuned for all of that starting April 10th. And for everything Daredevil, Marvel, Roth Cornet, keep it here on IGN.com.